In this podcast, we will talk about SALT and what happened in Helsinki. SALT stands for Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. This was an agreement between the superpowers to limit the number of nuclear weapons that they had. The Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty was signed in 1972. No more strategic ballistic weapons could be produced, and the number of intercontinental ballistic missiles, which are known as ICBMs, could not increase. No nuclear weapons, launch sites, and launchers were also allowed. There were also clauses in the treaty about submarines. It said that new submarines that could launch nuclear weapons, which were called SLBMs, were only allowed as replacements for existing submarines that could launch nuclear weapons. The anti-ballistic missile, also known as the ABM Treaty, limited both sides to 2 ABM deployment areas. So they're only allowed 2 places to deploy anti-ballistic missiles. But the treaty did not cover immediate nuclear weapons, which were still being deployed by both countries. And by both countries, we mean the USA and the USSR. So why was SALT I important? Remember that SALT I is the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. SALT I slowed down the arms race, as no side had a clear advantage, and they stopped one side from gaining a further advantage. It was important because it showed the improvement in relations between the USA and the USSR. Nixon, who was the president of the US, and Brezhnev, who was in control in the Soviet Union, visited each other's countries over this period of time. SALT I also led to further negotiations, which included SALT II. So, in SALT I, they agreed that there'd be no more strategic ballistic weapons produced, no nuclear missile launches were allowed, and SLBMs were only allowed as replacements for existing submarines. And why was it important? It was important because it slowed down the arms race and improved international relations. Let's have a look at now the Helsinki Conference, which was in 1975. There were several agreements signed at the Helsinki Conference by the USA, Canada, the Soviet Union, and all European countries, excluding Albania and Andorra. And in this conference, they focused on topics such as security, human rights, and border issues. The agreements made at the Helsinki Conference were split into several different baskets or parts of the treaty. In Basket 1 was that the current borders of European countries were inviolable, which meant that they couldn't be broken or violated. Basket 2 was promoting trade and technological links across the Iron Curtain, which was sort of the separation between the East and the West. In Basket 3, it said that we were to respect human rights such as the freedom of speech in Europe, as well as free movement. All disputes were to be settled through the United Nations in a peaceful way. Education cooperation in the form of student exchanges and the sharing of scientific information was required. No country would be allowed to interfere in the affairs of another country. Countries had to respect human rights such as freedom of conscience, which is religion and thought, speech, movement, and information. There are also country-specific agreements. The East and West Germany now accepted each other officially as being named East and West Germany. The USA would also be allowed to buy oil from the USSR, and the USSR would buy wheat from the USA. The conference helped the USA and the Soviet Union to form a stable relationship, and they even cooperated on a space mission in 1975, which was called the Apollo-Soyuz Test Project. But there were some problems with this conference in Helsinki. The Soviet Union continued to apply the Brezhnev Doctrine in Eastern Europe, and dissidents, who are people opposing their policy, were treated severely. In practice, the Eastern Bloc countries did not adhere, so they didn't comply with the Human Rights Agreement. So to recap the Helsinki Conference, all disputes between countries were to be settled by the United Nations in a peaceful way. And no country would be allowed to interfere with the borders or the affairs of other countries. The Soviet Union continued to apply the Brezhnev Doctrine, which undermined Basket 3, which was about human rights. So the Helsinki Conference in 1975 was the high point of Detente, which is when tension was at its lowest, and it led to cooperation across the Iron Curtain. So after SALT 1, there was SALT 2 in 1979. So following the agreements of SALT 1 in 1972, SALT 2 was an arms race control agreement that ultimately led to the end of Detente. SALT 2 was based on the agreements between the USSR and the USA from the 1974 Vladivostok Accords. The treaty limited the use of multi-warhead missiles and the creation of new launch stations. SALT II was signed by Presidents Jimmy Carter and Leonid Brezhnev in Vienna in June 1979. Though it was signed in 1979, it was not ratified, which means it was not made an official policy by the US Senate because of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. This meant the treaty was a failure. So SALT 1 was important, but SALT 2 didn't work that well. Let's have a look at some of the views on SALT 2. Some US politicians thought SALT 2 conceded too much to the Soviet Union, and it was never ratified by the US. West German politicians believed it made the USA less likely to use nuclear weapons to protect it. Limits on the number of missiles did not reduce the overall numbers of missiles that each country had.